Tonight on Enigmatic Anomalies, the Betty and Barney Hill world-famous UFO abduction story told from a perspective you've never heard before.
Good evening, and welcome to another episode of Enigmatic Anomalies, EA-TV. I'm your host, Terry Ling. Imagine, if you will, you're 13 years old, and you're sitting at the kitchen table when all of a sudden the phone rings. Your mom picks up the phone and begins to speak to your aunt. Nothing strange about that, right? But while you're listening, you start to understand what it is they're talking about. Your aunt and uncle have had an encounter with a UFO. Tonight, we'll be speaking with Kathleen Marden, the niece of Betty and Barney Hill, the famous 1961 UFO abduction case that took place in the White Mountains of New Hampshire and changed the way we all think about UFOs. And we're going to find out just how this one isolated incident affected the rest of Kathleen Marden's entire life. Kathleen is an author, speaker, and lecturer, having written books with the well-known physicist Stanton Friedman, as well as being the abduction research team leader for the Mutual UFO Network, MUFON. To say that this one incident had a profound effect on Kathleen would be a gross understatement. I caught up with Kathleen in her Central Florida lakeside home, where we had a chance to sit down and have a good long conversation about all of this. I hope you like it. Hi, Kathy. Thank you so much for letting us into your beautiful home today to do this interview with you.
It's my pleasure.
You know, I want to ask you, if I could, a little bit about this incident that you've lived through, and get your side of the story from a 13-year-old's perspective. So here you are, your mom's in the kitchen ironing, the phone rings, and you're in the house, you're within range of the phone, and you're overhearing a conversation between your mom on the line with your Aunt Betty, who is your mom's older sister, correct?
That's correct.
And what happens? How does this interact with a 13-year-old?
I was home from school that afternoon, and I heard a one-sided part of the conversation as my mother was talking. And I was really perplexed by that because there was a lot of concern in my mother's voice. And finally she hung up the phone and she said to me, "That was your aunt, and she and your uncle were driving through the White Mountains in New Hampshire last night when they saw a UFO up really, really close." She called it a flying saucer. I don't think we called them UFOs back then. And they're afraid that they might have been contaminated because it was so close. And she said, "I need to call our neighbor, who is a physicist, and ask him what Betty should do." And so she then called the neighbor, who was a physicist, and then she called Betty again and said, "Do you have a compass?" He said, "If you have a compass, you should take it out to the car and see how the compass reacts when you put it near the car. Of course, it's going to spin when you put it up near the battery." But Betty then did that, and she called my mother back, and she said, "I did it, and when I put it over the trunk of the car, I noticed these shiny circles that hadn't been there. And when I put it over those circles, the needle would spin and spin. But when I moved it away, just a few inches, the needle would drop down. It would only spin when it was there over those circles." We were really curious at that point. We wanted to get down to Betty's house and see the circles and see how the compass would spin when it was placed over the circles. So that was a little bit exciting to think that we were going to actually go down there. But they were also fearful that they might have been contaminated by radiation. But they had taken long showers when they arrived home. And so that really helped too. And they had left their luggage out on the porch. They took precautionary measures, in other words.
Now, you're looking at this from a 13-year-old's perspective, so were you afraid to go to the house and be close to the car, knowing that there was all this caution being taken?
I wasn't afraid because I knew that we were not worried about the circles on the trunk of the car. We were worried more about the contamination of clothing and that sort of thing, and contamination of Betty and Barney, because they were so close. This UFO was hovering 100 feet above them. So they were very, very close to it. It had hovered over the top of their vehicle, and they heard a series of code-like buzzing sounds that were striking the trunk where those circles were. And so that was the big worry. But within a couple of days, my father drove the family down to Betty's and Barney's house, and I got to hear firsthand how they had had this very, very close encounter. As my father sat on the couch and talked with Barney about the non-human entities that he had observed on that craft through binoculars.
What did your dad think of all this? Had your family been exposed to UFOs previously?
My family really had no interest in UFOs whatsoever. Betty and Barney had never read a book on the topic. We hadn't. It wasn't a big family interest, except for in about 1957, 1958, my mother had a multiple witness sighting of what we now call a mothership. It was this huge craft that was hovering over a field. She was on her way to do the Friday night grocery shopping and saw this and ran to a nearby home, and the people who lived there went out and they also witnessed this with my mother. And there were little discs that were flying around and they were flying back into the craft.
Wow, that's an amazing story
in
and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
So she wasn't a stranger to the concept of this. So, and obviously she had shared this with Betty. So Betty being her older sister, she would have had that conversation. So it would seem logical that Betty would call her now and say this happened to her.
That's correct, yes.
Wow, so your family was somewhat targeted, it seems like. You weren't traumatized, that's a good thing. And I understand, while we were speaking earlier, you were sharing with me how it was kind of a family secret. You didn't want to talk about it. And when people did show up to do all of the checking on all these different things that had happened, you were pretty much sworn to secrecy. So being 13, how did you deal with that?
Well, that's correct. And the family explained to us children that it was very important not to share this story with our classmates because of the way the public might perceive this sort of thing, the impact that it would have on the family. My Aunt Betty was a social worker for the state of New Hampshire. Barney worked for the post office. They were active politically in the state of New Hampshire, and in fact, in 1964, Barney was appointed to the U.S. Civil Rights Commission State Advisory Committee. So they were well known in the state for the good things that they were doing for people, and we knew that this could potentially cause them to lose their jobs, their standing in the community, and we wouldn't want that to happen. So we knew that we could talk to scientists who were investigating the case, to family members, but it sort of reduced the desire to tell our peers about it.
Sure, and very understandably so. And I would have to agree, gosh, that's a great family unit that you came from. That's very impressive. We'll be right back with more from EATV's interview with Kathleen Marden. I hope you'll stay with us. When it comes to UFOs, Florida is a hotbed of activities. I'm standing here at the exact location of my first UFO experience, which turned my world upside down and led me to MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network. From contact to abductions and sightings, Florida MUFON is dedicated to finding the truth. To learn more, go to meetup.com/Florida MUFON, or to report a sighting, go to MUFON.com.
So this obviously must have really changed the course of your life.
It absolutely did, because I was fascinated by it. And when I found out that an abduction had actually occurred, I also became fearful. Knowing that anybody could just be out at night and a UFO might swoop down and take possession of you and take you onto that craft and do a physical examination against your will. So it was very frightening to think that these non-humans didn't look anything like us, didn't behave anything like us, could do this to us. So that's where the fear actually came in.
So did you spend years then obviously checking out books and reading things so that you would know to get more information about this subject?
Over time, I started reading. The first book about my aunt and uncle's story was released in 1966, and that is because there was a violation of confidentiality, and somebody talked to the media, and it was reported in a very, very big way. It became national knowledge very rapidly, and so Betty and Barney decided they would cooperate with an author, and Dr. Benjamin Simon, who was a renowned psychiatrist who worked with them, said that he would cooperate too. So that was my first book, I think, on the topic. And then over the years, as I carried out my professional career, I went to college, I was a social worker, decided to change careers and became a teacher and then an education services coordinator. So over the years, I would read books that had been written on the topic of UFOs and abductions as well, and had the opportunity, being Betty's niece, to talk to many of the leading researchers in the field as well. So I had a lot of inside information and was fascinated with this topic. I think that once you learn about it, then it's really hard just to put it down and not to go back to it. It's so fascinating and such a mystery. So I read more and more. And then in 1991, I joined the Mutual UFO Network. I wanted to investigate Betty's case on my own. And MUFON offered a training program so that I could become a field investigator. And I used those skills to investigate Betty's case on my own. And over the next 15 years or so, it started in 1990 when I began the investigation. Over the next 15 years or so, I researched and investigated Betty's case. She turned over about 40 years of investigative files to me, all of the original reports.
Oh, that's amazing.
The hypnosis tapes of the sessions that Betty and Barney had with Dr. Benjamin Simon over a 6-month period. For comparative analysis, I wanted to know if this was a real event or if it was information passed from Betty to Barney and then repeated under hypnosis. So all of this went into my personal investigation.
So you were able then to sit with your aunt face to face as an adult
Absolutely.
and discuss it all.
Absolutely. I visited her house at least once a week and taped hours and hours of interviews, I played devil's advocate. She and I went up to the close encounter route. I attempted everything possible to refute the veracity and the reality of her experience.
Good for you. That's great. I would have done the same thing. And the findings?
I have concluded that without a doubt, this experience was real.
Yes, absolutely.
But in addition to the spots on the trunk of the car, the dress that she was wearing that night was in excellent condition when she put it on. She'd only worn the dress a couple of times before. When she arrived home, there was a 2-inch tear in the zipper at the top of her dress, in the stitching. There was a 1-inch tear in the thick zipper fabric. The lining had been torn from waist to hemline, and the hem was torn down on one side. Betty knew that that dress had to be repaired. She placed it in her closet. The next time she took it out, there was a pink powdery substance on that dress, and that pink powder that saturated parts of that dress were saturated in the spots where Betty later recalled the ETs had actually touched the dress. Around the shoulders, where the ETs had wrapped their very long, thin 3 fingers, 4 fingers around her shoulders as they escorted her to the craft, and also around the hem of the dress, where when they removed the dress for a physical examination, it dropped to the floor. The tops of Barney's best dress shoes were so deeply scraped that he had to purchase a new pair of shoes. The binocular strap he was wearing that night, it was a leather strap. It was cleanly severed because he was so frightened that he was going to be captured as he stood in a field looking through binoculars up at these non-humans, that he violently pulled the binoculars away from his eyes and ran back to the car, breaking the strap in the process. The watches that they had been wearing that night were wind-up watches. They had checked them at 10 o'clock at night. The next morning when they returned home, they looked at their watches and discovered that they had both stopped running. The watches never worked again.
When it comes to UFOs, Florida is a hotbed of activities. I'm standing here at the exact location of my first UFO experience, which turned my world upside down and led me to MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network. From contact to abductions and sightings, Florida MUFON is dedicated to finding the truth. To learn more, go to meetup.com/Florida MUFON, or to report a sighting, go to MUFON.com. Hi, and welcome back to our conversation with Kathleen Marden. As we continue, we'll hear more about the abduction and the famous star map drawn by Betty Hill, finally proven true by modern-day science.
Kathy, so tell me, isn't it true that Betty had received some information while she was on the craft, and it was a star map, and she wanted to take it with her? That was covered in one of your books, and I remember reading it. So do you have possession of that star map?
I do have a copy of it, and there's also a copy at the University of New Hampshire in an archival collection that we set up on the Hill artifacts. But yes, Betty had finished, the ETs had actually finished Betty's physical examination. One of them, the examiner, left to go into the next room to examine Barney. And Betty had at that point lost her fear of the one that she called the leader. And so she said to him, "Well, I know you're not from around here. Where are you from?" And so he sort of produced this 3-dimensional image of a star map. And there were 2 stars on it in the foreground that were about the size of nickels. And then there were a number of other stars, 16 stars in all actually, that were connected by lines, I believe. And some of the lines were solid and some of them were dotted. And Betty had the impression, this was telepathic communication, that some of these represented trade routes, whereas others represented expeditions. Now, Betty had a photographic memory, and this was very, very important because Dr. Benjamin Simon asked Betty to reproduce that map if she could remember it accurately and it didn't bother her too much. And she did. She went home and she sketched the map. And she took it back into his office, and that map was then published in the first book that was written about Betty's and Barney's experience. Marjorie Fish, who was an amateur astronomer, a member of Mensa, meaning that she had a genius IQ, lived in the state of Ohio. And she saw that map. She was skeptical about it, but she thought that if she could find a match for Betty's stars somewhere in our galaxy, that maybe this would confirm that it was a real event. And so she started going to the university, and she would have to sit down and she would have to hand copy all of the distance data. And remember, we didn't have photocopying machines back then.
Oh, right.
And she couldn't take the catalogs out of the university. So she hand copied all of the distance data. She would take it back to her house, and she started building three-dimensional models. She built 26 in all before she got a match. She started this work around 1967, and she didn't complete it until 1972.
Wow.
She couldn't find a match. She thought that she would find many, but in the end, she found only one. And she found only that one when a new catalog came out with distance data that wasn't there in the earlier years. No one knew about this when Betty drew this star map, but she had a perfect match, or a near perfect match, for the map that Betty had drawn. And all of the stars on Betty's map were sun-like, although only 5% of the stars in our local galactic neighborhood and that area of space were sun-like. Pretty extraordinary. The identification that Marjorie did indicated that the ETs had come from the Zeta Reticuli star system, the net in the southern hemisphere. Pretty remarkable work. And this is how I met Stanton Friedman, who ended up co-authoring the first book with me, because he was the scientist who was called in to find other scientists to vet Marjorie Fish's work for accuracy.
So that worked out amazingly, but even more than that is the fact that it validated her once again.
It
Not
did.
only the dress and the powdery substances on the dress, or all the other things that, the trunk of the car, and just everything that made this particular abduction experience valid. I mean, really, a star system, that's just something that, as far as I'm concerned, is the last nail. You know, it's absolute.
And even with today's new distance data, Betty's map is approximately 88% accurate. And there's research that is continuing. There were alien symbols that Betty saw on the craft. And sort of a tablet, she called it a book, but it wasn't like any book that we had back in 1961 when this occurred. She opened it up, and inside she saw symbols. Well, in the year 2000, I asked her to sketch the symbols if she could remember them. And remember, she had a photographic memory. And she, over the next couple of weeks, was able to remember some of those symbols and to sketch them for me. And I kept them in a locked file. They were published for the first time and captured the Betty and Barney Hill UFO experience. And a college professor, Don Dondery, who I mentioned, read my book, saw the symbols there. This was in 2007. In 2004, he had done an alien symbols research project with Dr. Stuart Appel from the State University of New York at Brockport and Bud Hopkins on experiencers that the late researcher Bud Hopkins had hypnotized, who had sketched symbols. His symbols were kept in a locked file. Well, Dr. Dondery decided to compare Betty's symbols to the symbols that Bud's experiencers had sketched, and these symbols were nearly identical.
What a transition from Betty and Barney to you, and now into MUFON and all of this that is happening around it with your books and all the other people that are gaining validation for their experiences. And it does seem like there are so many people who are finding their validation through these books and what you're bringing to the table, what MUFON is bringing to the table. It's amazing, it really is.
It's an exciting time to be part of MUFON
It
to
is.
be part of the research that is going on this topic.
Absolutely. Well, Kathleen, thank you so much for being with us today. This has just been wonderful. I've always wondered about how a 13-year-old might have looked at this, and I can't imagine, had this not happened, where you might have been, but it's so amazing that you have brought so much to the table in ufology and been such an integral part of the information that has come forth. And of course, in the state where this happened, there was something erected right on that site.
A historical marker.
Exactly. So, I mean, and that's no small thing. That doesn't happen with every abduction case that you hear.
No, for a state to actually erect a historical marker to commemorate a UFO abduction experience is almost unheard of.
It is, truly, but it's amazing, and I'm grateful that it's there, and it speaks volumes for those who have had abductions as well, and it helps validate, I think, because a lot of people, and especially young people who are involved in families that have this kind of thing, I'm thinking they're growing up thinking, what do you do with this? How do you handle this? You know, how do you wrap your mind around it and still go to school and make good grades and all of that, you know? Obviously, you had no problems. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for letting us into your home. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today.
It's my pleasure indeed.
Thank you for joining us tonight. We hope you enjoyed our interview with Kathleen Marden. We'll see you next week on another edition of The Strange and Mysterious on EA TV. For Enigmatic Anomalies, I'm your host, Terry Lang, saying good night and keep looking up.